Welcome back, everybody. Last week we finished by talking about Kuhn. Today we're going to begin by talking about Kuhn's aftermath. It was not what Kuhn hoped. So Kuhn's work caused a major paradigm shift in the study of science. So that might have been what he was hoping for. He was hoping to have an impact, obviously. Most scholars are hoping to have an impact on their field. But it did so, in part, by profoundly shaking people's faith in this dream that was once shared by Comte and the logical empiricists, this idea that science can deliver positive or certain knowledge. Now, I'm not saying that Kuhn wanted to deliver on the same dream, but Kuhn definitely did not want his work to have skeptical or relativistic implications. Those sorts of implications that were drawn out of his work and continue to be drawn out of his work, he didn't like it in much the same way that we saw that Karl Popper's work had skeptical implications, and he didn't like that at all. Kuhn had similar feelings. So, this happens. Arguments, just like actions, often have unintended consequences, and one of the unintended consequences of Kuhn's work was that people extracted this sort of skeptical argument from it. They said, science periodically undergoes paradigm shifts. So that is obviously a feature of Kuhn's work. That's one of the major claims that he makes. Scientific paradigms are incommensurable. And I talked about that last week. Incommensurability just means there's not a common measure that allows you to translate claims from one system into the other. So if you're talking about the solar system in the Aristotelian paradigm, where the Earth is at the center of celestial rotation, and that allows you to make basically every explanation and prediction that you make within that system, those explanations and those predictions that you're making in that system will not translate into the Copernican paradigm, where the sun is at the center of celestial rotation, and all the explanations and predictions within that system are made on the basis of the sun being at the center of things. So those are incommensurable paradigms. There's not a common metric that unites them. Third premise of the argument, new paradigms need not rely on the methods or findings of previous paradigms. And again, you see that in the case of this switch from the Aristotelian paradigm to the Copernican paradigm. When that paradigm shift is made, the evidence from the Aristotelian paradigm, the theories, the arguments, the whole sort of conceptual armature of that system that had been used for 1900 years to gradually build that system up and make it what it was, that wasn't carried forward into the Copernican paradigm. It was a totally new paradigm. And sure, it was drawing on some of the same evidence base. Of course, they were looking at the same world like we talked about last week, but it wasn't like they were making cumulative progress. It wasn't like they said, okay, the Aristotelian paradigm has done all of this great stuff. We're going to build on that. We're going to add to that. No. They said the Aristotelian paradigm, most of it is false. We need to get rid of it and start afresh from the sort of Copernican groundwork that we're laying now. So not only are they incommensurable, but there's no sense in which one new paradigm can be understood as having progressed from the former paradigm. Okay? This leads to the conclusion that there's no good reason to think that science makes progress, that it has a single method, or that it is currently getting things right. So there's no reason to think that science is making progress because new paradigms don't build on the evidence base of old paradigms. For the most part, they scrap them. And there's no reason to think that science has a single method because a new paradigm doesn't rely on the methods of the old paradigms. They use different methods. Oftentimes, the discovery of a new method is what sort of leads to an initial break that will then become a new paradigm. And finally, because of this idea that there are periodic paradigm shifts kind of baked into the practice of science, you get this, what's sometimes referred to as pessimistic induction. Given that all of those past paradigms are wrong, and that people who were in them, kind of in the midst of them, were strongly committed to the idea that they were true, shouldn't we, on the basis of that evidence, hypothesize that we too are in the same predicament? That we're sort of neck deep in this paradigm and all of its commitments, and we think that it's true, but it probably isn't. That's sometimes called the pessimistic induction from the history of science. So out of this, you get this pretty relativistic picture about the practice of science. Science isn't discovering the truth. There is no single truth. Rather, science is describing the world relative to a particular conceptual framework or paradigm. And there are competing frameworks, and the frameworks change across time. And so Kuhn's work leads to this shift away from method towards the study of practice, this more sociological orientation towards studying science, and also a shift away from the individual towards communities. Individuals aren't what's important in understanding the way science works, at least not from a Kuhnian perspective, because he's interested in paradigms, and paradigms are really, again, in this spirit of Fleck, carried out by thought collectives, by groups and communities that share ways of doing things. And it also paved the way to science studies. And science studies, in particular, the Edinburgh School, developed a kind of full-blown Kuhn-inspired relativism that argument that we just talked about describes. Basically, on the basis of Kuhn's theory, we can arrive at these claims that all scientific claims are ultimately relative to a paradigm, and that there's probably no good reason to think that science is getting things right. So maybe we shouldn't trust science at all. So after Kuhn, we have to ask, if there's no single scientific method, and it's unclear that scientific knowledge is cumulative in any sense, how can we tell if scientific work is good or not? And on what basis should we trust or distrust science? Not only should we trust science, but what's the basis for our trust in science? That's what we're going to talk about today. Oreskes thinks there's a good answer to it, and that it has come out of a very specific tradition in the philosophy of science.